Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We love college football and we hope you do too. During the season, we look at the race for the college football playoff champion. In the offseason, we broaden it just a little bit. Spring has sprung. Well, not really, not here in Minnesota, but at least for college football, the spring camps are springing up, and we wanted to take a quick look at some of the storylines we're going to be following. It's a bigger playoff, so more teams have a shot to get in. More college football means more of it to love, just like me. Hi-oh. As always, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Can't take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We always enjoy your reviews. But all of that said, let's get springy with it. How are you doing, Shehan?
I'm doing well. It's definitely pushing into spring weather down here. I think it's in the high 70s right now. It hit 90 the other day in Texas. So weather's a little different around the country. I don't know if you knew that.
Yeah, I heard that. I mean, I had to get up at 5:45 this morning to take my younger kid to school super early so he could get on some buses and go to a sleepaway camp with his fourth grade class, except it's going to be like 30 degrees, which is actually kind of warm for here. So it's going to be like 30 degrees. But I mean, my older kid did it a couple of years ago with snow everywhere. And I'm like, this is crazy. That's all I kept thinking, like, because I grew up in California. So yeah, I do know the weather changes a bit, but my goodness. So my kids this is something they're used to, the idea of going out to a camp in March and enjoying that lousy Smarch weather, however you want to look at it. I mean, it's something else, but you know what? Football never stops. So we got the spring games coming up. We've got our spring, I should say, camps are going to culminate in games for the most part. But there's always good storylines going on here. So I thought, let's talk about it. As you said, what's one of the, I mean, how are you categorizing it? I kind of went thematic with this. Are you looking at specific teams?
I kind of have a mix of both of them. I think that, there are obviously so many coaching and quarterback changes across the country. That'll be something to watch. And just to take a little bit of a step back, I mean, look, let's kind of talk about spring camp in general, right? People love to overreact to this stuff. They love to overreact to spring games. They love to overreact to a coach saying a player's having a great camp or something like that. So to start things off, I kind of want to go through what I, as a reporter and as somebody who covers the sport nationally, am looking for whenever I am covering spring ball kind of as a whole. And one thing is certainly, with the spring game, I want to see film of especially new quarterbacks, right? I want to see how comfortable they look under center. I want to see, the way that they're throwing the ball, because we haven't had a lot of access to see a lot of these guys throw in live action before. And that's kind of something that translates to a lot of players. I want to just see how they move. I want to see how big they look on the field next to other starters. I want to see how precise they are, how they're running routes. Granted, you're only going to see vanilla offense and defense. You're not going to see anything crazy, nothing exotic. You're not going to really get a good feel for how they know the playbook. But I think that you can at least get a feel for timing, for precision, things like that. I think that you also want to take a look at how have guys changed physically over the offseason. There are examples of, especially, with redshirt players is a great example of it. So many players come out and they are 30 pounds heavier in spring camp and listed that way than they were heading into the previous season, because they've had a whole year essentially to try to get ready for this time. And the other part too is just kind of getting a first look at a staff, whether it's a head coach, a new coordinator, the way that they're talking about their players, the way that they're talking about their teams, the way they're kind of laying out their philosophy. So again, will we know at the end of spring camp what teams are going to be good? Not necessarily, but I think it's a great opportunity to kind of check our priors a little bit and learn a little more about what a team might be trying to do come the fall.
How do you think the spring portal window has affected the spring camp?
Yeah, I think that there's more urgency to have position battles than there might have been in previous spring camps. A lot of the time in previous spring camps, you're talking about guys just going out there trying their best, but understanding if it doesn't go well in the spring, we'll have a chance in the fall to maybe push my way into the rotation. But I think that the blessing and curse of the spring portal window is that guys have a strong understanding of their place on the team right away. Obviously, I'm down here in Texas. I went to Baylor. There was a great example of this 2 years ago, which was Gary Bohannon, the quarterback who won Baylor the Big 12 in 2021, came back, but he was getting pushed by Blake Shapen, who also played a huge role on that team. And Baylor decided to name a starter before the spring window closed so that Gary Bohannon could go out and find himself a new program, because he knew that he wasn't going to come back if he didn't win that quarterback job. Now, not every team and program is going to do that, but I think that players do have a little more of an understanding of where I stand, what is my pathway to getting on the field. I think with these new staffs, certainly, Alabama is a team that I'm going to get to in just a second. I think that they're going to really have a focus on, the spring is a clean slate for everybody. That you don't have sort of the implicit preferences for guys who are recruited by this current staff or developed or any of these things. You get a fresh start, but that can also mean that if you don't make a good first impression, you're kind of ready to go. So I think that the spring portal window has added a lot of urgency for guys to make their case, for them to move up the depth charts. But ultimately, again, I think that these are battles that if they didn't go in the spring, they were going to go into the fall.
Meanwhile, where's Blake Shapen right now?
Blake Shapen is at Mississippi State now, playing for Jeff Levy.
Yeah. So that'll be interesting. I didn't get too into, because I think both of us probably ran into this question, because you could go through so many teams. So I tried to keep mine, I think, a little bit more towards teams that had a more likely shot at the college football playoff. Again, there can be surprises. We've certainly seen plenty. I mean, after TCU a couple of years ago, really, any team's on the table, only underlined by Washington last season, but certainly more so for TCU. But my goodness, where do you want to kick off? Which question kind of is the leading one in your head?
Yeah, I'm going to start by going out west. And we've mentioned this program a couple of times, but let's go ahead and focus on it. And I'm going to talk about USC's defense. We obviously saw a complete staff overhaul with them bringing in D'Anton Lynn at defense coordinator over from UCLA, but that wasn't where they stopped. Of course, they bring in Eric Henderson as defensive line coach, Matt Entz to coach linebackers and be kind of the head coach in charge of defense. This is a very different staff than the one that Lincoln Riley brought to Los Angeles with him from Oklahoma. And not just in terms of the actual position coaches, but philosophically, I expect this staff to be a lot different. People complained about Alex Grinch and the way that he ran things, but a lot of what they did was on purpose. They wanted to run a speed defense. They wanted to force turnovers. I think you look back at some of these mid-2010s Big 12 teams, the most successful ones were the ones that were able to steal possessions and give their offense more possessions, and not necessarily the ones that tried to get stops every single time, but tried to get teams off the field. And so I think that Lincoln Riley leaned on that a lot, something that worked, by the way, for his former mentor, Mike Leach. And now I do think he's going to play more of a traditional style of defense, one that I think is going to emphasize stopping the run. We saw that D'Anton Lynn did a tremendous job of coaching that at UCLA, one that I think is going to be bigger and a little more physical. We've seen them get a little bit more bulky in the trenches, I guess you could say. And I think ultimately this is a program that is kind of recommitting itself to being a balanced program. Now, again, we've never seen Lincoln Riley fully pull this off. The improvement from year one to year two under Alex Grinch was legitimate at Oklahoma. They did improve. That's kind of the revisionist history of Alex Grinch and Lincoln Riley, but that did not happen during his time at USC. So I'm going to be very curious to see, bring in guys like Isaiah Rakes, bringing back Bear Alexander. Are these guys going to be able to add a physical presence that ultimately can help change this program?
Yeah, and I know it's interesting too, because you've mentioned some of the people they brought in, because it's impressive that not just D'Anton Lynn, like stealing him away from UCLA, but also, as you said, Eric Henderson, Matt Entz, just getting a head coach from North Dakota State who was getting, I think, a little fed up about the fact he wasn't getting looks to come and join them, to get Doug Belk, who was a defensive coordinator at Houston, to come over and be their DB's coach. I am curious to see. I mean, and what are your thoughts? Do you think they're going to see how what they have, and then perhaps at the spring portal a little bit more than I think people expect? Because I was looking at the transfers and kind of, who's coming into USC, and I think more people just noticed the fact that, of course, they brought in, well, first of all, Miller Moss kind of threw off the plan by having such an incredible game at the in the Holiday Bowl, but they still got Jaden Mayava from UNLV. But I mean, do you think they're going to perhaps see who they need on the defense and get some spots in there? I mean, that's a question that's kind of been in my head.
Yeah, I think that that's going to be a huge part of their calculus. They also, again, I mean, you look at the transfer class that they brought in so far, and the one that they brought in last year. I think that they feel like, especially on that defensive line, they can get a little bit more out of it. I'm excited to see Anthony Lucas with a little bit better defensive line coaching. He was a transfer from Texas A&M as well. So ultimately, I do think that. Again, one thing I'm going to be very curious about, and this is actually something again that I'm going to be kind of keeping an ear out for, is with USC and with Lincoln Riley, a lot of these offensive coaches tend to structure their practices to benefit the offense. Again, I covered Baylor back in the 2010s. This was something that you heard a lot, was that the defense never necessarily learned great fundamentals because they were having to practice against the offense that was moving a million miles per hour. Now, I don't think it's quite the same for a Lincoln Riley offense. It doesn't use pace the same way, but I'm going to be curious. Do we see more hitting in camp? Do we see more tackling in camp? That's something that I think that USC has not embraced under Riley in a significant way. And you're going to have to do that, I think, moving over to the Big Ten. So again, we won't necessarily know. And because of how secretive Lincoln Riley is, maybe we won't get to hear much about it in the spring. But I do think that this is an aspect where if you're going to recommit yourself to defense, and by the way, if you're going to bring in North Dakota State's head coach to run your defense, this is how you do things, man. You get physical, you practice physical.
Now I'm imagining USC is going to borrow those robots that Dartmouth was using to reduce the amount of tackling, except making them a lot more violent and angry. And somehow, that's where Skynet was born. Not in a military lab, but they accidentally made some linebacker or some running back robots that were a little too violent that decided to have a singularity and go on. But, I love the USC selection only because when I was looking at, I ended up becoming more categorical. I realized there's another team that also kind of fits into the mold, although they were more successful last season. That's LSU. Because, of course, the offense, it's more or less like how they're going to reload. Garrett Nussmeier, they've got a new QB coach, but I think, again, it's not going to be a big question, like who's going to replace Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas. They've got plenty of guys who can probably do that. But on the defensive side of the ball, they've got a bunch of guys, actually staff, I should say, returning to fill in roles. So you got headlined by Blake Baker from Mizzou. They were able to get him to be their defensive coordinator. He's known to work with linebackers before. Getting Harold Perkins is a tremendous linebacker. It'll be interesting to see if they can help him reach the next level, because I know there was a little bit of disappointment based on how he had done in 2022 heading into 2023. They've got Corey Raymond, another LSU alum, coming back to coach the DBs and try and regain the reputation as DBU that LSU has had. And then you've got Bo Davis, who they got from Texas, to be on the defensive line. So I think there's a lot to go there. And I love it too, because the storylines just write themselves, because as we know, and as some of you out there may know, LSU and USC opened the season together in the venerable old Vegas Kickoff Classic, heading into its second season in, I believe, 3 years, because they skipped last year. But that's going to be an exciting game to see both of these programs in Allegiant. And I do fear that maybe one of these two teams, or both, perhaps their defenses really haven't improved enough, but we're going to see either the other offense not spew, or maybe both offenses just look on fire, but it turns out the two defenses just aren't quite there yet. So it's going to be one of those great games for, I think, a lot of perhaps overstatements of how each team might have done. But the fact that these two teams are going to square off in the opening week is absolutely perfect, considering how similar they are in what they're trying to do.
No, I totally agree. It's gonna, I think, be a game that defines a lot of the 2024 college football season, and kind of kicks us off to a big start. And by the way, these are two coaches who obviously have a lot of similarities with them kind of leaving and taking the big contracts, and it'll be a great opportunity to kind of tell where are each of these programs just a couple years into this experiment.
Yeah, I mean, the last time this game was played, at least the neutral site game, was Arizona and BYU. I got to say, the story for this one's going to be way bigger. I mean, big credit to them for bringing these two teams in. That's super exciting. Kind of in another vein, kind of a thematic area where I was looking at several teams and I realized all of them have the same issue. Was trying to figure out, looking in the spring, how are these transfers, these big name transfers, going to mesh? And I mean, Ohio State, Ole Miss, Texas, those are the three I decided to kind of hone in on, only because, arguably those are the three biggest teams in terms of the playoff race at this point. Ole Miss clearly won the signing race for the transfer class. I mean, they've got so many guys headlined by Walter Nolan, of course, from Texas A&M, Juice Wells, Logan Diggs, Princely, I always get it wrong, Uman Mielen, right? Did I do that?
Yeah, Uman
okay,
Mielen,
all right,
yeah.
sorry. Now, here's the awkward thing, obviously, as co-hosts, we have complicated names in and of themselves, so I always feel bad when I kind of mangle somebody's name, and that is definitely on me. But again, so many big names there. It'll be interesting to see how they can mesh with teammates. And then obviously Ohio State and Texas, we've talked a lot. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you think? Do you think these are programs that should smooth these through, or do you have any concerns looking into it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that when you look at these three programs, they kind of each have slightly different strategies, right? Like with Texas, I'd make the comparison to Georgia or Alabama last year, where they kind of have these targeted transfers. And I think that when you are targeted, it's easier to find spots for guys. I will say it's going to be very interesting with them to see how these wide receivers kind of fit in and replace the two guys that they're losing, because these are two of the better guys that are being lost in college football this year. Um, with Ohio State and Ole Miss, I mean, they're kind of trying to transform who they are in some ways. With Ohio State, you see this kind of shift to a run-based attack, both at the quarterback and running back positions, with Quinshon Judkins coming in, Will Howard as a transfer from Kansas State. You do also have Aaron Noland and Julian Sayin as well as quarterbacks. So that's going to be a storyline that I'll be watching, as well as kind of, I expect Will Howard to be the starter, but even who ends up being the backup, I think is going to be a great kind of topic of conversation. Lincoln Kienholz, Devin Brown getting in there as well. I can't imagine that all of those guys are still on campus by the time that the 2024 season starts, but who knows? It's going to be a fascinating dynamic to watch. And then with Ole Miss, you're kind of talking about them also shoring up a specific spot. They are shoring up the trenches. They got Walter Nolan to come in. They got two transfers on the offensive line from Washington. And so that's what I like about all three of these teams. I think that they brought in a lot of transfers, but they brought in a lot of transfers with a purpose. They knew exactly what they were trying to address. With Ole Miss, it was depth. They need to get deeper and more powerful in the trenches. With Ohio State, they're kind of undergoing a shift a little bit in both their offensive and defensive philosophies. And with Texas, they're kind of just trying to fill gaps where they feel like they've maybe lost some talent and are bringing some young players along. So I think that all three of these teams are poised really well to integrate what they've brought in. Will it be enough to kind of get them to title level? I think that's going to be the $1 million question in a lot of ways. But I kind of like the disparate ways that each of these three teams attack their strategy.
Absolutely. What's another major topic that's kind of got your attention heading into the spring?
Yeah, I think for me, look, there are just so many teams that are integrating new quarterbacks, whether it's transfers, whether it's guys graduating. And so some that kind of came to mind for me, of course, Ohio State, as we mentioned, with Will Howard coming in, Riley Leonard transferring in to Notre Dame from Duke. He was somebody who I think proved that behind a less than dominant offensive line, he could be dominant and be a playmaker. Now he's going to be asked to do things in structure. And look, I mean, I think that that a great example is we talked about Sam Hartman on the last show. It's not a guarantee that just because you can do something one place in one system that you can do it somewhere else. But I'm going to be kind of curious to see. One, I expect he's going to be the starting quarterback. I expect that's not going to be a competition between him and Steve Angeli. But I'll kind of be curious to see how they handle that, just to see ultimately, is this what it looks like. I think that when even you talk about guys stepping into bigger roles, Jackson Arnold at Oklahoma is a freshman, now I guess going on sophomore, that they're really excited about. Had a very lackluster first half of the Alamo Bowl, but kind of figured some things out in the second half. Now he's going to be a full-time starter. Another great example, DJ Uiagalelei transferring back to the ACC, coming to Florida State. That Florida State-Clemson game is going to be very spicy. And so the other piece of this too is last year we had this conversation. The three heavies in college football were all replacing quarterbacks: Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia. And I kind of made the case this is the best year to try to get them whenever they're trying to integrate a year one quarterback. And that's exactly what happened. You saw the national championship game was between two established entrenched quarterbacks in JJ McCarthy and Michael Penix. So it's going to be a great challenge to see for these teams. Can they integrate players quick enough? And especially, can they integrate them well enough when you do have so many of the other top teams in college football, specifically Alabama, Georgia, and Texas, bringing back second-year quarterbacks who are extremely talented. So it's going to be a fascinating dynamic, and I don't necessarily know what to expect.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for some of the transfers who are kind of like, they're going to get it, like Cam Ward, no one's expecting anyone else at Miami to be the quarterback than Cam Ward. Will Howard to an extent, Riley Leonard to an extent. I'm curious to see, though, in the spring, will we have a surprise where someone who we thought, will Dante Moore suddenly step up, shake off the freshman issues with, mistakes, decision-making, things you expect as a true freshman thrown into being the starting quarterback in the Pac-12. And give Dylan Gabriel such a challenge that perhaps we go into the fall not being certain. And I mean, I would imagine it that way. We'd go into the fall not being certain. Not that they'd ever announce, because I think to an extent, the coaches and the coordinators can be a little smart and greedy about trying to keep talent in those spots. But I'm curious to see where that goes. Another big question actually I have is Michigan. I mean, because if we're talking about quarterbacks in general, that kind of leans into probably the biggest question as a quarterback battle. And for me, it's trying to figure out who's going to get out there at Michigan. Because you got Alex Orji, who obviously was more of a situational player. You've got Jaden Davis coming in, who's obviously a touted quarterback. You have journeyman Jake Tuttle, who got a seventh year after playing at Utah and Indiana and being there as a quarterback at Michigan. And then you've got other guys. And then the question is, are they going to just go into the spring? Because, again, they were late to the transfer portal and just grab somebody else, maybe whoever doesn't win at Oregon. I'm curious to see, what are your thoughts on Michigan?
Yeah, that quarterback situation is one of the most interesting dynamics because they lose a number of players on the offensive line, but Miles Hinton back at right tackle, Colston Loveland at tight end, I think is going to be a huge player for them. Samaj Morgan was a young player who showed some promise at receiver. I do feel like ultimately, when you look at Michigan and when you look at Shehan Moore, he has the opportunity to almost make a choice, right? Like does he want to go with a pocket passer like Jack Tuttle, or does he want to go with a more dual threat quarterback like Alex Orji? We saw at times during the 2023 season. This is somebody who loves leaning on the run. He is an offensive line coach by trade, and Alex Orji gives them much more of that running component. I don't want to make like a crazy but Alex Orji, you maybe structure your offense like he's Tim Tebow a little more, right? Whereas Jack Tuttle, you kind of do some of the early Harbaugh stuff where they're running a lot of pro style. I think that where I lean is probably more towards the Alex Orji side of things. I think that they're going to want to lean on that running game. And by the way, Donovan Edwards, Kalel Mullins, both back at running back for them. So this is going to be a team that runs the ball hard and runs the ball effectively. And once they run the ball some, they're going to keep running more and more and more. And so ultimately, I am pretty fascinated to see if that's the direction that they end up going, especially because, look, they're replacing a lot on both sides of the ball after winning a national championship, but they've got some big-time players coming back, especially on defense. Will Johnson at cornerback, Rod Moore at safety, Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle. And so do you just kind of try to play, not ball control necessarily, but do you try to shorten games like they've done? I think that's been so much Michigan's MO. I expect that Orji is just going to be the safer choice, especially, look, Jack Tuttle's a 7th-year player, man. If he wasn't really a factor to be as part of that quarterback rotation last year, I just don't know that the 7th year is going to be the one that he does it.
Hey, at the rate things are going, they'll just keep granting you years to stick around. I mean, we got the 9th-year guy at Miami, so we'll see where it goes. Kind of building off of this, another theme that was getting my attention was coordinators and some of the key ones that are coming up here, particularly on the offense. I mean, just this week, I was fascinated to hear Chip Kelly finally talk a little bit about why he was willing to leave, because everyone knew he wanted to leave UCLA and be a coordinator in the NFL anywhere. I think no one expected Ohio State, but still, I mean, nothing was entirely shocking just because Chip is kind of a unique bird in and of himself. And he is real, for the record. But sorry, I love the bird's not real thing. I had to tuck those in everywhere. But he was talking about how when they were doing prep for the LA Bowl, I mean, his quarterback coach had taken off to be the offensive coordinator at Oregon State, and he was happy for him, of course. But so he had to step in and be the quarterback coach, and he was talking about how he just loved it. He's like, I haven't really coached a player since 2008, like on that level. And being that CEO coach, his wife had apparently told him like he seemed happier than he'd ever been. So watching him, it made a lot of sense. It fit into, I don't know, again, it sounds like he'd been looking for a couple of years at leaving and departing and doing something else, but certainly it kind of underlined that. So there's a lot of interest to seeing, and for example, how he's going to do at UCLA. I mean, he's got a plethora of weapons to choose from. Probably at Ohio State, he's got a plethora of weapons to choose from that we just talked about. He enjoys calling plays. I'm going to be really interested to see how he gets to use this running talent as well as his quarterback talent, and frankly, who he thinks the order should be in that quarterback room, given his background and his reputation for developing quarterbacks. What other is, I mean, in addition to Chip, I mean, there's others. I mean, Tim Lester at Iowa. I think Iowa's going to be theoretically out there as a wild card to potentially move forward as an offensive juggernaut. Even though I don't think they're going to challenge for the SEC or even necessarily in that large spot, it's hard to ignore Bobby Petrino at Arkansas. Like I would be,
we can ignore him. It's very easy to ignore him.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I just love that story. I just can't get it over. And then you look at what he's got to choose from. I mean, the story of the Arkansas offense is probably going to be one of the most entertaining, like where's it going to go? Who are they going to use and how they're going to use them? I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated by that. But where are you at on that? Well, like which coordinator has got you the most interested in how they're going to fit into the team in this upcoming in these spring camps?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple that come to mind. Certainly Chip. I mean, that kind of goes without saying. I'm going to be fascinated to see Colin Klein moving over to Texas A&M, a very different type of offense, a very different type of coordinator than Texas A&M has obviously had the past couple of years, moving from an extreme pro-style system under Jimbo Fisher to one that will embrace the spread, will embrace the run, will potentially be creative using the quarterback on the move. Or, I don't necessarily think that they're going to use Connor Wegman in the run game. That's not his strength. But I do think that we will see him used more creatively. Getting out of the pocket, bootlegging, doing stuff like that. And we also saw over the past 2 years, Mike Elko is not sort of the negative stereotype of a defensive coordinator. He's somebody who the last 2 years, they hired Kevin Johns as offense coordinator at Duke, and they played a lot of creative offense. They weren't afraid to go fast. They weren't afraid to be explosive. And so I do think he's going to be empowered in a unique kind of way to kind of take things to the next level at Texas A&M. And, for everybody who's watched them over the past couple of years, we've seen Texas A&M. They have made the game very difficult for themselves. And I think that this is going to be something that helps quite a bit. To stick in the state, I mean, you could go to Baylor, right? Jake Spavital coming in, completely changing whatever they're doing, moving from a wide zone run offense to now they're going to be more of a spread. I think that when you look at their receiver talent, that might be something that works well for them. And they also bring in a transfer in Daquan Hardy over from Toledo at quarterback, who I think is going to give them a lot more in the running game as well. So I think that those two in the state of Texas are ones who are going to potentially be big time players.
So I've been tossing out a couple of these last sort of themes. What's another one, or at least another story that's got your attention coming into this spring game?
So
camps. I always say game.
I
always want to jump.
They're always tied.
It's force of habit.
So for me,
by the way, for the record, I just want to throw this out there. Might as well. One thing I admire in, again, this is an international college football thing, and it's something they do in Japan, and it only made national news in the United States because something like the quietest time ever, May, something happened over there during one of their spring games. But they actually do an exhibition schedule, like of underclassmen. It's like the freshmen and sophomores get a chance to just play like 3 or 4 exhibition schedule against some of the other teams. They get a chance to see everybody. And the reason it became, like, even the New York Times wrote on it, they call it the dirty tackle incident, and it became like a phenomenon. Like, some freshman linebacker ended up doing it was flagrant by any standard, a late tackle of this quarterback, and then it ended with the team. Like, well, it got crazy because of all the honor and stuff in Japan. Like, he had a teary press conference where he, does a thing where he apologizes, stands up teary-eyed, and does a solemn bow for a long period of time. And then things went out of control. Not only did that happen, then he said, like, I quit football. I disgraced, my university. It ended with the head coach being kicked out, the defensive coordinator being banned from the sport, and the entire team dropping football because the conference forced them to end their season for 1 year because they said, we did not feel you were sincere enough in what you did to rectify this situation. This team had just won the national championship in Japan. They had to sit out a season, and because they have promotion and relegation, they were automatically relegated because they went like 0 and whatever. I mean, like, can you imagine like that in the United States? But sorry, that kind of got into a whole other story there. But I mean, I love the concept of spring games. I think those are cute.
That's the takeaway. That's about the spring game. I don't think that we have quite the same system of like honor and right doing in the United States. I think that our college football is a little different than that. Let's keep this moving though. So a name that I actually probably should have mentioned whenever we were having this last discussion, Penn State and Andy Kotelnicki coming in from Kansas. I am so fascinated to see how that's going to go because you have a Penn State offense that talent has never been the problem, right? I mean, they've had dynamic receivers over the years. Jahan Dotson. You look Chris Godwin coming through, and you've had some quarterbacks who are pretty good. A Sean Clifford, a Trace McSorley, and Drew Aller was supposed to be the best of the bunch, and they have not gotten very much out of him. And now, with Andy Kotelnicki coming in, this is somebody who has been a miracle worker in a lot of ways at Kansas, at Buffalo, even all the way down to Wisconsin Whitewater as well. And I expect that he is going to add an infusion of fun to an offense that really has not had very much of it since James Franklin took over. Now, part of this is going to be, again, listening to James Franklin and what he's saying. Is this going to be Andy Kotelnicki's offense, or is it going to be James Franklin looking over his shoulder, kind of messing things and mucking things up to protect his defense? I mean, you have to let Andy Kotelnicki be himself and do things at a high level, or this hire is not going to work out. But again, I mean, when you talk about Kansas, they use so much misdirection. They use so much, sort of side-to-side spread action. I'm fascinated to see how they're going to use these two running backs that they've got, Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, maybe the best running back combo in college football in 2024. I expect there are going to be plays where Nick Singleton's taking snaps and running option stuff with Katron Allen, and maybe Drew Aller's on the field too. I don't know. They have so much upside if this works. And credit to James Franklin. We've talked a lot about Ohio State responding to Michigan winning a national championship. I think that this was Penn State's response to Michigan going and winning a national championship and seeing we literally cannot hang playing the kind of football that we're playing right now. And James Franklin has made no secret that his goal is to win a national championship, to become the first Black coach to win a national championship. It has not, in FBS, of course. It has not happened to this point. I think that Andy Kotelnicki is the kind of hire who, if you let him do his thing, which has been a James Franklin issue, can potentially change a whole lot.
Absolutely. And I mean, you think about the tools he's going to get with Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen in addition to Drew Aller. And I love the fact that you mentioned that he's going to try and hopefully introduce fun into it, because that's part of the reason that I think makes some of these D3 programs so successful. You got these guys that have to want to come and play for you. It's not like you're throwing a big scholarship their way. And hopefully Franklin gets out of the way. It reminds me of, you made me think of an analogy to how some of these programs and their practices were run. It reminds me of there was this famous incident where they were doing like, I forgot who it was, the Marine Corps University was running this like theory, this experiment of like running a war simulation. And they brought in this general, Peter Van Ripper, and they said, like, you got to, probably Paul Van Ripper, you got to pretend like you're, our enemy. So he got so creative that they had to stop the simulation and say, like, look, the U.S. isn't going to win if we keep running this simulation. You have to change what you're doing. So I mean, that analogy reminds me of some of these coaches where it's like, okay, no, but the offense still has to be good. We got to keep running, or the defense still has to look great. And you're not allowing that creativity to flow and some of these great opportunities. But that's a great one. Kotelnicki is absolutely going to be a fascinating one to watch. This is kind of a story that I don't know, like with Utah, because we've talked about them. They were favored to potentially win the Big 12. They certainly are. I mean, obviously Oklahoma State and K-State are potential contenders as well. And then there's other great solid teams, I think, in that conference. But to me, one thing I'm looking into this spring is, can they stay healthy? Because that's been one of the biggest issues for the Utes. I mean, Cameron Rising obviously got banged up in 2022 and didn't even get to play last season. You got Brant Keithy, the tight end, but they had so many other injuries. They had Micah Bernard, the running back, Micah Pittman, who was a Florida State transfer, and they've got that linebacker Lander Barton. Can they keep it together? Because they play a physical style of football, and maybe that's part of the reason why the practices and in the games, maybe they wear out. I'm not sure, but I really want to see how healthy Utah will actually be in the fall. And so the spring game is going to be a big question for me. I don't know. Do you have that concern at all? Watching not just Utah, but some of these other programs where we get excited, or some programs really get excited about the guys coming in, and then next thing you know, oh, that's not who we're going to actually end up with because some unfortunate, tragic injury that occurs.
Yeah, so I think that there's going to be a little more focus on health this spring than I think previous years, because these guys are about to have to play in a much longer playoff. Because they're going to have to go through a full season and a conference championship game and maybe a first round game and then play 2 or 3 more rounds of the college football playoff. And, I think that's going to make things so much harder for the ACC and Big 12 teams that don't necessarily recruit at that hyper elite level. That's going to be, I think, a huge issue for a lot of programs. But then again, like you mentioned, I mean, even just I think when you talk specifically about the Big 12 and the parity and balance in that league as well, I mean, you can't afford to fall half a step behind. What happened in the Pac-12 last year is kind of what the Big 12 has been for the past 5 or 6 years, where everybody's just kind of above average. And so I think that Utah is a great place to go because, like you said, I mean, it wasn't just that Cameron Rising was out. It was that they didn't necessarily seem to have the best options to replace him. And now, by the way, their 2 top quarterbacks from last year, Nate Johnson and Bryson Barnes, have both transferred out too. So you're in a situation where if it's not Cameron Rising, it's Luke Batari, who is not necessarily a player who you want on the field. And even you talk about Sione Vaki, who was their do-everything running back safety last year. He's gone too. So in a funny way, the margin of error for these guys' injury situations, I think, is going to be even smaller in the Big 12 in 2024 than it was in the Pac-12 in 2023.
Well, that's wild. I can think of a lot of Utes fans that are going to be that they probably are aware of it. If they're not, my goodness, that's going to keep them up at night. It's amazing. We've gone through this conversation. We have yet to talk about the new coaches that are coming in, the new head coaches. And that's certainly one of the new head coaches. And there's certainly, I mean, obviously, as we've talked about before, 3 of the 4 playoff teams last season all have new coaches, but we don't have to limit it to there. But of the coaches that are coming in, well, or should I just say of the coaches that are named Kalen DeBoer? Or, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what coach or 2 are the ones that have got the most attention for you heading into the spring?
Well, I do want to touch on Kalen DeBoer because I think that it is just so fascinating.
He's like his own category.
I know,
because of replacing Nick Saban. I mean, it's almost like it would be like, which coach are you most interested in seeing how they do? I mean, well, any other year you might have there might be a difference of opinion, but not this year. No, not this year at all.
Let's certainly come back around to Kalen DeBoer. I am curious. Look, I mean, I made the case this offseason. I feel like this was a great hiring cycle. I think that a lot of coaches and programs did a good job of finding matches with each other. The no-brainer is one like Sharon Moore, who was just promoted internally. I think that even you go and look at Washington, right, with Jed Fish, that was, I think, also a very straightforward, no-nonsense type thing. Jonathan Smith going to Michigan State, that is a tremendous get and a tremendous fit. They have to be so lucky and happy that that Washington didn't open until a little later, because Jonathan Smith at Washington would have been a very scary sight as well. I've mentioned earlier this year Kurt Cignetti at Indiana being somebody who I'm fascinated to see. Even Spencer Danielson at Boise State, I think that he has a chance to maybe lead the best potentially Group of Five program next year. But, to settle on one, I do also want to mention Del McGee becoming Georgia State's coach, former Georgia running backs coach. To me, he should have been the head coach of Georgia State a long time ago. I cannot believe that it took this long for him to kind of come in and figure things out. Look, when I look around, I think that some of the ones that I'm most fascinated by, I think it would have to be that Jonathan Smith pick at Michigan State. I think that he coming in, and we talked about this a little earlier this offseason, but he's a coach who knows how to be in the shadows a little bit and still maximize what he has. He's a tremendous developer of talent, identifier of talent, schemer of talent. He's never had the kind of resources that he will at Michigan State and the kind of focus that the program has right now in the aftermath of the Mel Tucker dismissal. And I think that this is a program, too, that is a sleeping giant when it comes to NIL and potentially player acquisition. You talk about that giant new television contract that's coming in. You talk about the access they have to Detroit and Ohio and the rest of the Midwest. And I think the other piece, too, that you have to like is Jonathan Smith has done a lot of recruiting of Texas and California. And I expect that Michigan State is going to go out to those places and continue to improve what they've got. So I think that this is maybe I don't even know if is it the best hire of the offseason? I think that there's a really good case that it is. And I will also say this is not going to hit year one. They are not going to be awesome in 2024. But when you talk about them heading forward, I think that this could just end up being a perfect fit.
Just as one other name I wanted to throw out there, and I want to ask you how you think they may do on a scale of 0 to oh my gosh, Sonny Dykes. No, in year one, no, that's unfair. But I'm wondering how Willie Fritz is going to do, and how quickly things are going to turn around at Houston with him there, because obviously a lot of connections to the area just from his previous stops, but also Tulane also has to look into that region as well. But I'm curious to see how well of a transition, how smooth of a transition it is. And how quickly we see that effect in the Big 12. I'm curious to see that, I think, more so than some of the other programs that are out there with new head coaches.
Well, I think there are two things you have to mention whenever you're talking about Houston heading into 2024. One, I mean, everybody that I talk to says it's going to be a tremendous fit. They're so excited about what he's brought in. I know that The Athletic did a survey of Texas high school coaches, specifically in the city of Houston, just a few weeks ago, and they were like, these guys have been in my door even more than the previous staff, and they've only been here a few months, and they put together a great transfer class with a lot of guys who either played for Willie Fritz or are from the city of Houston. So I have zero question about whether this hire is going to work out. I think that he is a tremendous fit. That said, this cupboard is bare, man. This is not a good roster. This is not a good program. There's a reason that Dana Holgorsen was fired. I know that Houston's president, Renu Khator, actually said that basically the reason that Dana Holgorsen was let go was because at a talk, he basically was like, yeah, we've given up on the 2024 class because we aren't going to get it and we're focusing on 2025. And when you're already like giving up recruiting classes as a head coach, like you can't be looking that far ahead. And ultimately, they put together the 61st best high school recruiting class in the country, which is not very good. It was even worse than that before Willie Fritz got there. So I think this roster is just in a hole right now. And I don't think it's a one cycle away type hole. I think it's maybe a 2 cycles or 3 cycles away type hole. But here's what I will say. I think that Houston's going to go out there. They're going to give some teams hell. They're gonna pull an upset that they have no business pulling, and then they'll probably finish second or third worst in the conference, just because I think that this roster is not ready for prime time. But look, if you are Houston, if you're Chris Pesman, their athletic director, if you're Tillman Fertitta, their board chair, I mean, just give them some time. Don't pull the plug after 1 or 2 years, because this is a coach who knows how to build a winner. Like you said, coming from the city of New Orleans, he used to be the head coach at Sam Houston State University down in Huntsville, just outside of Houston. And so he knows everybody. He is really well liked down there. And I am very confident that if given the pieces and the chances, he has a chance to really hit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it took a little while to get Tulane going because they were even emptier, arguably.
Yeah,
Because that's always been one of those. But he's able to build things up. Absolutely. He just had me thinking, like, that's such a Dana Holgerson thing to say. And I hope he gets like a talk show, like interviewing, like almost like on WWE, like those kind of silly fictional talk shows, except a real one, like sponsored by Margaritaville, where it's like on a beach somewhere, like interviewing somebody kind of with a couple of beers in front of them. Like that to me would be the perfect like next job for Dana Holgerson. Because I'd watch that. I bet it would be entertaining. It would be chill. And beers in the beach with Dana Holgerson. I'd watch that one. Oh my goodness. But how about Kalen DeBoer? We should talk about it. We saved it for the end.
I think that Kalen DeBoer is a very unusual hire in the best of ways for Alabama. This is not somebody who's ever coached in the South. He did not come up through major college football programs before he got to Washington. His Power 5 coaching experience was at Indiana, and his head coaching experience was in NAIA and at Fresno State. But I think that there's some things you have to like about it. I wrote a story about him right before the national championship game for CBSSports.com, and the biggest thing that I took away from it is that he is just somebody who figures things out. And that can be in recruiting, that can be in development, that can be in the transfer portal, anything. Like he's just somebody who figures things out. And going into a roster at Alabama, where he's going to have the most talented team that he's ever had in his life by a mile, even with all of the departures so far, I think that that's going to be a real positive for him. And look, I mean, Jalen Milroe, working with Kalen DeBoer is a scary thought, right? Like that is something that I think could really work in a big way. They're going to know how to maximize both his passing and running ability. At the same time, I mean, this is not the staff that I was hoping that he would end up with whenever he did come, right? Like, I mean, they already have lost multiple assistants to other jobs in the NFL. Notably, Ryan Grubb did not come with him as offensive coordinator. Defensively, I like a little more what they got going on. Kane Womack, the South Alabama head coach, hired as their defensive coordinator, and Mo Linguist as a defensive backs coach. But I'm going to be curious, right? We're going to learn pretty quickly, I think, and probably even this spring, whether Alabama and Kalen DeBoer are up for the challenge, whether they're up for the pressure of replacing Nick Saban. How does he handle the kind of media scrutiny? One thing that we talked about whenever Washington was in the national championship game, when we were down there in Houston, is, man, Washington, for a program as good as they are, is really not covered all that much. They do not have that kind of media environment. Alabama ain't going to be like that. So we got our good friends over at AL.com leading the charge on that. But you even see, I mean, my team over at 247 CBS Sports, they just added Alex Scarborough just to cover Alabama for 247. Like this is one of the great writers in college football right now. So this is a different kind of media market. It's a different kind of pressure. He's replacing the greatest coach in the history of college football. And by the way, he's never coached further south than, or like southeast than like Indiana to the east and Fresno State to the south. Like, it's a different kind of animal going now to live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and have to deal with all the complications that comes with. Again, I think that Kalen DeBoer is a star. I think that Alabama, the institution, can do things to protect him just a little bit from all of the outside pressures. But this is going to be a fascinating hire.
And I am absolutely like, it'll be interesting to see because I mean, 17 years, and the time I guess crept by on me because I remember when he was retiring, everyone's like, "Wow, he's been there for 17 seasons," and I kind of went like, "Wow, gosh, I really only feels like not that long ago he was at Miami, but
Yeah,
coaching the Dolphins."
agree. I was really enjoying the seventh grade at that point.
But there's the thing. I mean, how many people in Alabama just, when you don't start paying attention to college football when you're born. So how many kids like in Alabama like that are going to be in their 20s, that got really into the program or even 30s, you know, all they knew was Nick Saban. So this spring practice, this spring camp, I mean the scrutiny on I assume are they having a spring game? I mean that's going to be I can't even imagine. I assume it'll be a sellout, just because everyone's going to want to see what Alabama's going to look like. Um, this is tremendous. I can't even imagine the amount of attention, the amount of pressure on just the scrutiny on such what might be minutia, might not even be important because, as you said, like, at the beginning of this show, going into the spring camps, you got to be a little bit careful about how people talk about, oh, this is the greatest camp we've ever had, or, this guy looks great. And then you actually put him against a defense that isn't kind of playing along with how the practice is being run, just runs over them. But I'm absolutely looking forward to it. I think he is by far, it's just such a special situation that it's a category in and of itself, the replacement of Nick Saban and how that's going to progress. And, how thrilled are some of those holdover? Because again, that was the thing. He inherited such a rich cupboard that even with all the departures, he still got probably arguably the most talented or one of the most talented teams in college football. But got a spring portal window coming up. Some of these teams are now looking for guys. Maybe some of those guys will now start to look a little bit further, especially going from the Saban situation, the Saban organization and how he runs things in his way to DeBoer. I mean, it'll be fascinating to see. I mean, there was a quote, an interview with Saban I just read actually today where he was talking about how he was starting again. And I admire Saban and how he talks about this stuff. He's like, look, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but he was noticing that some of his players were talking more about like not only getting touches on the ball, but how much money can you get me to stay? A lot of these questions where you realize there's an evolution in the sport. And it was one where he wasn't sure if he was even necessarily getting it. Like he was that concern that was kind of coming out of that interview. And again, to his credit, he's like, I don't know if it's good or bad. It's just evolving. And looking at how some of those players are going to act with Kalen DeBoer and with the situation in Alabama as it moves forward. As we kind of slowly wrap this up, it's been a while since we asked a question. It's been a couple of weeks. I want to know, Barry Odom totally got my heart when he decided, for those who aren't aware of, obviously Barry Odom, he's the head coach of UNLV. He had a great initial season there, took them to a bowl, just really excited, got things excited in Vegas. But for a promotional event to kind of raise money, it was, I believe it was called the Horns and Helmets at South Point, which is one of the strip, bottom of the strip, not on the main strip in Las Vegas. They have a huge venue, so they had a rodeo. So he got on a bull, and not just on any bull, not a mechanical bull. He got on a real bull called the Widowmaker. And he decided to do a straight up bull riding event. Like he's I think 47, 49, somewhere in that range. I'm 44. That sounds so crazy now. Maybe in my 20s when I was in better shape, working out all the time, I might have done that. But he lasted maybe 2 seconds generously and just watched him. If anyone's ever watched bull riding, he got the full effect of bull riding in there. I mean, luckily not major injuries, but got a good shaking. And I thought to myself, what would be something fun for a head coach to do to get attention to their program and get that? Can you top bull riding? Is there something and you haven't had a chance to think about this, but I mean, I had to bring it up because first of all, I love what he did, but is that something we should see more coaches do? Because I mean, that got a viral moment. I think a lot of people were like, whoa, the UNLV coach is riding a bull. It's something Nick Saban certainly wouldn't do. Maybe Kalen DeBoer, I don't know. But I mean, what would you do? What would be something fun to get people's attention? Like Harbaugh, okay, I could see him willing to do it freaking anything. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think Kalen DeBoer's from South Dakota. I assume that he's probably just already done that. I'm assuming that he just rope steers or goes horseback riding just all the time. I don't know. I don't really know much about South Dakota. I mean, can you beat Bill Self dancing with a gold chain and Snoop Dogg. I don't know if you can get a whole lot better than that, especially after you are under active investigation by the NCAA for paying players. That was like an all-time flaunting wealth moment. And the craziest part is that it didn't even come back to bite him. They didn't even get hardly any punishments as a program. That to me stands apart as probably the best. Do you have one in mind? I'm going to think a little bit more if I have another idea.
Well, I was thinking I would love to see some of these coaches that are in the better shape. Maybe a Marcus Freeman, enter, and the show doesn't exist anymore, but something like an American Gladiators, have them actually enter something where, because, this kind of came up, someone said that the NFL Combine is kind of like the Olympics for football players. You get them to see. And I thought, well, can we still analyze the players and do something fun with them, create an American Gladiators type of thing, have them run through a whole, gamut, like the Eliminator, where they have to run through a bunch of things. So it might be fun to see some of the coaches do that, or maybe do a joust, with the pugil sticks or something, and just to raise money. Again, come up with some great charity, get Nick Saban to chair it, because again, if you get him to do it, suddenly everyone will come. I just want to see some. I think it would be fun. I think that's something where, for example, historically, and you've seen this evolution, I think, as well as I have, college football used to be stodgy. It still used to hang on to just a certain level of stodginess. And I think over the time, especially with some of the transitions, not only with the head coaches and administrators, but also the sports information directors to an extent, a willingness to try things to get to, I don't know, the youths, however you want to say it, the Big 12 certainly suddenly started leading the charge with Brett Yarmark, because the guy is willing to, being from his NBA background, willing to look a little looser and try some fun stuff. So I'm trying to think of what would be something that could get their attention, that could get the public's attention, and maybe just do something like that for a program. I mean, Ohio State's head coach, Ryan Day, doesn't need to hop on a bull. He doesn't need to do that. I mean, he could go for it. I mean, he's a big dude. I would love to actually watch how that would go. But I mean, I'm trying to think some of these smaller programs, if you're trying to get attention, if you're in New Orleans, I don't know what you can do that would be entirely I don't know, go while on Bourbon Street may not be the greatest way to sell it, but
another great one was so Oklahoma State has a tremendous wrestling team, right? That's probably their signature sport.
One of the best.
And Mike Gundy very famously did a promo for them where he was decked out in a wrestling singlet, and that photo still flies around the internet all the time. I think that that's a sort of thing, right, where I think you just have to find. I think a great example of this too would be okay, if you raise this amount of money or whatever, I'll do our pro day or something like that. And I think that would be great for the coaches who maybe aren't in the best of shape too, right? Who would absolutely be down for something like that would be Biff Poggi over at Charlotte, right? Just him running the 40, or him racing the fastest guys on the team or something like that. I think that physical battles are always something that are pretty funny. You kind of alluded to that with the American Gladiator thing. I think that I think that that's definitely something where maybe having a one-on-one basketball tournament or something like that, or I don't know. I think that things where you get these coaches out there to do physical feats against other players on the team, especially. I think that's always fun. I think that always makes for a good time.
Yeah, exactly. Because the Duke's Mayo Bowl, the Holiday Bowl suddenly introduced that eggnog dunk that I was not aware of until there was a picture of Lincoln Riley getting dunked by that. I mean, we've proven that people like seeing the head coaches acting silly and having a little bit of fun.
Getting just a little embarrassed.
Maybe that's what we got to do. We got to start consulting business, coming up with wacky things for head coaches to do, and to bring some attention and get people hyped up. I love it. Oh my goodness. Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap this up. I think we've kind of reached the end. We're getting to the silly season here, but we want to thank all of you who listen to us, and we want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you get a chance, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find us on X and TikTok at the CFB Survivor Show. Not the I always tend to throw that in there, at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work on CBSSports.com. and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.